conference, session 3D on structural change. So we have 6 papers in this session, and we're going to have 2 paper presentations followed by Q&A, 2 more Q&A, and then 2 more Q&A. And each presenter has 8 minutes, and I'm going to give them a 1-minute warning. So the first paper is by Gaaitzen and Vries from University of Groningen. Gaaitzen, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Kunal. I'm presenting a paper that's titled A Manufacturing Renaissance, Industrialization Trends in the Developing World. And it's co-authored with Hagen Kruse, Emmanuel Mensah, and Kunal Sen. So the paper steps into a research question, which is about the industrialization opportunities that countries have at lower levels of income. And various scholars have documented worrying findings about deindustrialization in various developing countries. Particularly, they have highlighted the role of or the appearance of what looks like premature deindustrialization, especially for countries that had industrialization phase in the past. And at the same time, various other scholars, including Maggie and Emmanuel Mensah, have argued that especially in the context of Africa, there's a lot of countries that actually still are at the start of what could be considered an industrialization phase. And using a new data set, which is the GTDC UNU wider economic transformation database, we aim to step into this debate about patterns of industrialization that are observed in developing countries. And what we'll do is I'll present several baseline regressions here that are the type of regressions that built on a long tradition in development economics, starting with the work by Hollis Chenery in the 60s, but recently really popularized by Danny Roderick in his Journal of Economic Growth paper. And in those regressions, basically what we do is we aim to capture those industrialization patterns during particular periods by examining period dummies for the 2000s and the 2010s relative to the 1990s. So these period dummies would show the manufacturing employment share of each period relative to this excluded decade, which is the 1990s. But first, let me update you on this new data set. It's the ETD in short, and it has consistent time series information on real and nominal value added in local currencies, as well as persons engaged. It's showing those numbers for 12 different sectors of the economy. These are the broad sectors of the total economy, including manufacturing, but also distinguishing various services, in 51 economies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and with yearly data from 1990 to 2018. One of the things of this database is that it was constructed on a country-by-country basis by investigating the availability and usability of all statistical sources that we could find. And the data set that is publicly available and actually was recently revised is fully documented. So there's a sources and methods technical working paper that you can find together with the data to see how it was constructed and what sources were used, as well as what methods. And if we focus on trends in the manufacturing employment share, these are the countries that Roderick distinguished in his figure 5 in his 2016 paper on premature deindustrialization. And if you look at the trend in manufacturing employment share over that long time period, you see that several of these sub-Saharan African countries had an historical peak in manufacturing, often around the time of their state-led industrialization strategies. But what's interesting to note is that several countries appear to be experiencing what we then call a manufacturing renaissance, in the sense that if you look at Ghana and Nigeria, then in recent years, there's been a reversal in this declining share of manufacturing employment and in fact, a fairly rapid expansion in their manufacturing employment shares. And for Ghana, actually close to or maybe exceeding its historical peak. For many other sub-Saharan African countries, the trend that this database tends to suggest is that there's actually a manufacturing naissance. Many low-income sub-Saharan African countries still need to start with their industrialization process, and what this plot suggests is that they're actually experiencing what we would call this manufacturing naissance. Now, if we run these regressions, these baseline econometric regressions on those countries, then first of all, I need to point out as this is preliminary results. We'll have to revise them using the revised ETD dataset as ourselves that we released lately. And what you see in those columns is regressions that were run for the global sample, which is in the first column, as well as by region in subsequent columns. And the table reports results for the manufacturing employment share as the dependent variable. And the key parameters of interest are those for those decade fixed effects in the 2000s and the 2010s, which in these regressions are relative to the excluded period, which is the 1990s. And the first column, where you see that encircling in the blue box, shows that in the aggregate sample, the decadal dummy for the zeros is significantly smaller compared to the 90s, suggesting deindustrialization. Yet the decadal dummy for the 10s is not significantly different from the dummy for the 90s anymore. Subsequent columns show these regressions then by region, and they suggest that deindustrialization continued in the 10s in Asia, but it's mainly occurring in high-income Asian economies, as the third column shows that in developing Asia actually had a higher manufacturing share in the 10s compared to the 90s. The results for Latin America are comparable to the aggregate sample, but most notably, the estimates suggest that the average economy in sub-Saharan Africa, excluding Mauritius in the final column, has an about 1.9 percentage points higher manufacturing employment share in the 10s compared to the 90s. And Roderick found that sub-Saharan Africa, the manufacturing share declined by 3.5 percentage points for the period from 1960 to 2010. So our point estimates suggest a recovery of manufacturing where more than half this downward shift observed in the decades before. And well, so what we actually then have in this paper is that we examine industrialization and we pay attention to the sample of countries from the region, also to country heterogeneity. And we document there's an expansion of this manufacturing employment share for numerous countries in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. And we think that these findings carry important implications about the opportunities for growth and poverty reduction in these countries. Yet they also create obviously interesting questions. First of all, why has there been a reversal in industrialization? And what's the nature of the production activities that expand? And yesterday, Roderick talked about this in the keynote lecture, that is this mainly informal, or is it also an expansion of modern manufacturing firms that what we're observing? And their findings for Tanzania and Ethiopia suggest that it's mainly mainly informal, and would be very interesting to know whether that actually applies more wider. And the other question is whether this manufacturing renaissance or naissance for some of these countries is actually sustained, or whether it will be short-lived. And whether that will happen depends on how strong actually the mechanisms are that are driving premature deindustrialization, and whether they still work in the most recent years compared to earlier periods. All right, that's it. Thanks for your attention. Happy to answer questions.
Gaaitzen, very well timed. Thank you. Finish exactly on time. So
Great.
we can move to the next presentation. That's by next paper by Hector Moreno of the University of Oxford, Income Mobility in a Changing Macroeconomic Environment. Hector, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Kamal. Let me share my presentation, which you should see right now. So I'm Hector. Thanks for the invitation. I'm presenting a paper on income mobility in a changing macroeconomic environment. The motivation for this paper is that the analysis of income mobility is somehow limited by the scarce availability of panel data, household panel data, or when this is type of information are available, we don't find them for interesting periods or for historical periods. So what this paper does is we precisely fill this gap in the literature by providing short-term income mobility trends for 3 decades over a period that is precisely characterized by the lack of panel data and by a changing macroeconomic environment. So the empirical strategy consists in constructing 14 short-term synthetic panels, so this 2-year separation in each year, using a methodology developed with François Bourguignon that relies on the use of cross-sectional surveys. And we use, the paper examines 3 concepts of income mobility that I will discuss later on. So let me jump directly to the conclusions for the sake of time. The paper finds very low levels of income mobility for these 3 concepts over the course of these 3 decades. And this is a regular observation that we find, except for periods of rebound economic growth that we observed after 2 very strong economic crises. These movements, however, seems to be only transitory deviations since income mobility soon returned to their characteristic level. So in a way, the paper documents some rigidities in short-term income mobility that let me compare with the idea of stretching a rubber band. So first, we observe very low income mobility. Then we observe that this increases in periods of economic rebound after economic downturns, but then we return to the characteristic levels, which are very low. So let me describe the complex notion of income mobility. And to do that, let me use a very simple example for the sake of time. I hope I will not miss a lot of precision on this example. So suppose that we have panel data for 2 years. We observe individuals and their income, and there is some economic process between these 2 years. So that Charles, for instance, that was doing very well, in fact, after this economic expansion, he did very well, just like Mike and Maria. The thing is that Maria and Mike switched positions after this period. However, the case of Elisa is different because she was not doing well. In fact, she was at the bottom of the distribution, and she ended up worse off. So that in the end, after this transformation of incomes, the inequality that we observe in the first year is smaller than the one that we observe after these transformations. So these are the 3 notions of income mobility that I'm going to refer to. So it's directional mobility, the changes in position, and the effect of mobility on inequality. All these characterizations are based on the work of Janty and Jenkins and Fields 2019. So the contribution of this paper to the literature is that we are able to perform this precisely in the absence of panel data. So basically, we exploit cross-sectional household income, and we apply the methodology of synthetic panels that are based on matching and calibration techniques. I'm not going to spend time on describing this methodology. Let me show you that these results are encouraging. Applying this methodology allows us to reproduce the income distribution in the final year. For instance, in this graph to the right, you see the observed income distribution for 2018 and our estimation for the same year based on the cross-sectional household survey of 2016. So as you can see, the approximation is close to perfect. So what are the context? This is the context. This is the GDP, Mexican GDP. There are 3 things that I want you to to keep an eye on it. First, very strong economic crisis that are followed by a sudden and a sharp rebound that is in a way similar to in magnitude to the actual the current crisis of COVID. And of course, there are other periods of economic crisis, but they're not as intense as those that I refer at the moment. So let me show you the results. Let me start with positional mobility. So the exchange of units between along the income distribution. And I'm going to show you two indices. The vertical axis, now we don't have years, but we have periods of 2 years. And in the vertical axis, we have the value of these indices. The larger the value implies more movement, exchange mobility, and the lower the value implies more persistence. And what we see is that overall, the level is close to the origin, it's close to zero. And you can see 3 peaks here that precisely occur after these periods of economic downturn, which is interesting. So this is what we observe when we focus on exchange mobility. But what happened when we add new information and we consider the sign of this change, whether it's income gain or an income loss? So again, I'm going to use directional mobility index. In this case, positive values implies income rise, negative values implies income fall. And you see again that we, of course, as expected, we see a very strong income fall in these periods of economic crisis. But again, you see that the curve is not that far away from zero, which implies, again, very low levels of income mobility.
Hector, 1 minute.
Thank you. I will conclude soon. So the last is the effect of income mobility on long-term inequality. And I'm going to use 2 indices. In this graph, you see 2 curves. In this case, larger values implies more equality after this transformation of income, or negative values implies less equality. And these 2 indices precisely describes, again, a very small variation, at least not very different from zero, although you can see that the confidence intervals are different from zero, but the value is very small. So again, we observe that there are some peaks that occur after this economic crisis, but at some point they lose momentum. And these are precisely the 3 remarks that I wanted you to keep in mind. First, this paper documents low levels of income mobility, except for periods of economic rebound that happens after this economic crisis, 1995 and 2009, one internal and the other external. And this, very importantly, this deviation seems to be only transitory, since the economic mobility that we observed seems to return to their characteristic levels. For those interested in the methodology, you can access to the paper, OFI working papers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hector. So we have one question now for Gaaitzen, and then I have a question for Hector too. So Gaaitzen, the question for you from Callum Hamilton is, to what extent do you think these differently staggered industrial policies are down to specific policies or to a general step in the development escalator? So is this finding indicative of a new stage in development or a new stage in policy? Would you like to respond to that question?
Sure. So our analysis, in a way, does not have a lot to say about industrial policy. I mean, potentially it is one mechanism that could influence industrialization, but some of the papers I listed highlight various mechanisms that could either drive industrialization or actually premature deindustrialization. So what I stressed also at the end, I mean, it's not necessarily that we are refuting that premature deindustrialization is occurring. It might still be that for those countries at low income levels, that they reach their peak again at a low at a lower share and at a lower level of development than what happened in the past. I do think that some of the conditions have been changing, and some of the mechanisms may work differently in the past decade and in the period before. And one key difference, I think, has to do with rising wages in China. That is opening up possibilities for other developing countries to take over some of the activities that were previously done there, making use of low wages. So that's definitely a difference. And perhaps also, I mean, but then I'm speculating, perhaps the policy environment is also a bit more open, given the ongoing changes in the global political order. So let me leave it at that before I speculate too much.
Okay, thanks so much, Gaaitzen. So Hector, I had a question for you, and this is about the methodology that you proposed in the paper. So Peter Landau and co-authors have been also looking at synthetic panels. So how different is your approach, different from the Peter Landau and others' work? Because they also are using synthetic panels with fairly short periods and using repeated cross sections. Could you just tell us a little bit about the difference between your approach and the earlier approach on synthetic panels?
Okay,
Thanks.
thanks for the question. It's a very good question, and I'll try to be very brief. Let me start by saying that both of them have a common ground, which is they are based on the estimation of some sort of persistence parameter across time. And the first difference is that we compute this parameter very differently. We both use pseudo panels, but the approach is different. The way we do it allows us to obtain much narrower confidence intervals because we duplicate the number of observations. We compute a system of equations. That's one thing without going into technicalities. The second thing is that we ensure that we replicate the target income by applying calibration techniques. So we force the methodology to reproduce the distribution of the target income. And I would say that these are the two main differences. There are some others, but I would say for the sake of time, these are the two main important.
Very clear. Thank you so much, Hector. And of course, people can read your paper that you already sent a link to. Excellent. Thank you. Let's move to the next paper then. That's by Dino Moreno from the World Bank. And the paper is titled Better Jobs for More People in China's Economic Transformation. Dino, over to you.
Thank you, Kanav. Hello, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to present. I think the week has progressed. I'm starting to see just how well you've put this conference together. So I'm going to talk about some things that have come up already in the week and are coming up just now in this session. But I wanted to introduce also my co-author, Hanchen Zhang, who's the real expert on China here. And to explain that this is evolving into a research paper. We have started with a policy paper that was actually an input to a poverty study in China, but it started to get some attention, and consequently we were asked to write it up into a full paper. But we're sort of halfway through, so there's more to come. If I may, I want to now. If the slides are moving. Can you see the slides moving?
No, we can't. Oh, now we can. Yes.
Okay. Very good. Let me put this on full screen. So the motivation for the presentation really is one of exploring long-term patterns in jobs and structural transformation in a very rapidly growing and very important economy. And to break down these patterns using both macro data as proximate determinants of what we observe, but following micro data in order to see what's going on in terms of labor movements and in terms of the worker characteristics. Who is it that benefits from these movements, and who, if anyone, is left behind? But the macro entry point to this, as we started to work on the paper, and this is a topic that we're going to try to take up in in a global paper that maybe Ian in closing can talk about. But the sort of macro theoretical framework here is that we're trying to.
Dino, when just a sec, I just got a chat something from Ian Walker. I don't think you can see the full screen version of your presentation, and it's making it a bit difficult to read your PowerPoints. Can you try and see if you can?
Okay.
I think that's better. Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah. Can you see the screen yourself?
No, I only see my presentation in front of me.
Okay. All right.
It would be best if we didn't see Dino and we just saw the PowerPoint. In other words, is that possible? So that the PowerPoint would take the whole screen. Is that
I think
you can move. You can also move on your own screen and make the left panel larger, and the right panel with the person smaller.
yeah, that's much better
that's
actually.
it. That's it. That's it.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
Okay. So just to recap, the interesting macro issue here is how to reconcile the Kuznets facts with the Kaldor facts. And this is probably something that only people around my age remember studying, because they're not really talked about very much these days in the growth literature. But you'll see in the work that we're doing that we're really investigating this in more detail. We really want to see whether these Kaldor facts hold across countries over time, and what are the drivers of the observed Kuznets facts, the changing patterns in GDP shares and employment shares. But the paper itself was to suggest future jobs strategies for China. The data sources, it's great that Gaaitzen is here. We've used the Penwell tables. The latest update for China in June is reflected in these slides. We've also worked with the GDDC and the UN wider economic transformation database, World Bank indicators. And on the micro level, China's household income project surveys, there are 5 waves of that. The most recent 6th wave is not available through the authorities. And a panel data is now being used in order to try to look at what happened after the period of 2013. The literature on that we're referencing here, I think Gaaitzen already mentioned, but it goes back to Kuznets, Circuit and Chenery, and Maggie and Danny Roderick's work on structural change. And we're looking at these drivers that we think are important: demographic change, relative factor accumulation, changes in patterns of demand and net trade, so absorption in the economy and net trade. And then, of course, there's this issue of the relative productivity of different sectors. Using labor productivity is a very rough and dirty proxy for technical change across sectors. So we decompose per capita GDP. We use a Shapley method that is in a paper by Sharks to get to the productivity coefficients, and within the productivity, the labor productivity coefficients, we use De Vries, Timmer, and De Vries as the decomposition method. And we're then drawing on some very useful standardized labor indicators that the World Bank's jobs group, our group, has been producing, in order to apply these to the CHIP survey and investigate patterns in these labor indicators for rural workers, urban workers, and migrant workers. We then derive wage gaps, and we estimate wage equations for hukou status, which is the migrant status, and the location of the worker. And as part of the investigation into changing patterns of demand, we're also trying to look into the importance of non-homothetic preferences in China, investigating changing patterns of consumption as China got richer through the growth and transformation. So very briefly, those of you who know China know that they have experienced exceptional growth since the mid-1980s. If you look at the chart in the middle here with growth rates, you'll see that compared to, say, Latin America, China's growth has outstripped Latin America's growth by an average of 4 to 5 percentage points every year since around 1990. So this is a very large economy moving very quickly. And if you look at the chart on the right-hand side here, you'll see that this was a fairly recent phenomenon. So in terms of output per capita using the Penwell tables measure on the right side here, China has grown sevenfold in terms of per capita income since these reforms began and since these movements of workers started. This is quite incredible, and the numbers that you're going to see will be percentages and there'll be shares, but you have to bear in mind that this is a share of a very, very large number indeed, and almost unfathomable. But the movement of people that occurred in this period is bigger than the labour forces of 5 of the largest European economies. It's really quite stunning, the numbers we're talking about, but you'll see shares here. So not only was growth dramatic, but the structural change that China undertook was dramatic. On the left-hand side here, you'll see these decompositions of fast-growing countries compared, and China stands out in relation to all of them for very rapid productivity gains, especially in manufacturing and agriculture. And that you will pick up in the middle chart here, which shows the shares of both GDP and employment in China by sector using the ETD data. You see that the movement has been dramatically out of agriculture. Labor has moved into trade services, construction, and government services, and to some extent business services. GDP, however, didn't follow this this movement. So agricultural GDP has declined in share, but nothing like as much as the decline in employment, and as a consequence, productivity in agriculture has been rising. The other interesting thing I think to note here, for those who don't know China, as I didn't when I started doing this work, is that the role of manufacturing in this is quite nuanced. Manufacturing is not the dramatic increase in employment. The manufacturing sector did not absorb this massive movement of labor out of agriculture in the proportions that I expected to see. So you see here that as a share of employment in China, manufacturing actually declined slightly during the period, but because its share of GDP increased by double the decline in employment share, the productivity gain in manufacturing shows up as highly significant indeed. Now to go on to the micro...
just quickly, we're sorry, 1 minute left. If you could wrap up in a minute.
I'll shoot through. To go on to the micro, China shows all the patterns that we talk about when we look at job diagnostics across countries. You see on the left-hand side here, the movement from rural to urban. You see, we call this formalization, but you see the movement and the significant importance of waged employment in the second chart, that paid employees was the big change. In the third, where we're looking just at youth, you see it's young people that were making this movement from the rural to the urban and across sectors. And in particular, young people were moving into service sectors. And then finally, during this period, China also improved human capital or education status. But this is a very interesting point, I think, that's being picked up by other authors at the moment. As of 2013, still only 35% of the population had completed or above secondary education. So it's a dramatic improvement in where China was, but it still means that there's an awful lot of people at the lower end of the income chain. So very quickly, what did we observe in terms of wages? And this is really very interesting, I think, and points towards what a lot of Chinese authors have been writing about reaching the Lewis tipping point at around somewhere between 2002 and 2007. Wages were rising, both the mean and the median, and interestingly, in the rapid period of growth between 2002 and 2013, the median rises faster than the mean, which is kind of interesting. So they pulled up a lot of people through this process. Relating the rural to the urban and the migrant to the urban worker, you see that there is convergence in wages at a time when wages start to rise quite dramatically. So the labor market in China tightened. Now, when we got to question what was driving this great performance, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side here, and this is where we start looking into patterns of demand and net trade, you see that labor income was rising faster in terms of growth than was consumption. So people had disposable income which they were saving, but GDP was growing faster than both labor compensation and consumption. And so as a consequence, there's a huge increase in capital deepening, savings and investment in gross fixed capital in China, which you see in this next slide here. And I just draw your attention to the middle one, which shows that the growth in the capital stock was rising dramatically, whereas growth in skills adjusted or human capital adjusted employment was falling, partly because the employment with aging, the employment share the population starts to decline, and is verging on being negative soon. Relative to the United States, and I wanted to have a discussion with Gaaitzen offline about this, but using the human capital index relative to the United States, and then the capital stock in comparable prices relative to the United States.
Do you mind getting to the final slide, if that's okay?
Okay, will do. Physical capital was what converged. Very quickly, there was a significant role for investment, but there is significant scope for domestic demand. Interestingly, in China, the richer people, their pattern of consumption doesn't look too different from people at the lower end of the chain. So we think there's a lot to be got from domestic demand in terms of driving structural change further. So this paper extended, or rather extensions to this paper, we want to extend the period of analysis up until 2018 using this new microset. We want to deepen the analysis of hourly wages and wage gaps, consistent with our regression work that you'll see in the paper. But I think in terms of a future research agenda, and this is maybe something to talk about once this conference wraps up and reflect on, we want to explore these drivers of jobs and structural change, relative prices, the relative price of capital services and wages, sectoral deflators, perhaps using the ETD, and deepen the analysis of domestic demand factors, these non-homothetic preferences. How important is domestic demand in these large economies? If, as Danny was saying, there is a change in the external manufacturing driver of structural change. But I'll leave it to that. Sorry, I ran over. Thanks.
You're next. So Maggie McMillan, Tufts University. We're now moving to a very different part of the world. Africa's manufacturing puzzle, evidence from Tanzanian and Ethiopian firms. Go ahead, Maggie.
Hello. Nice to see so many people, so many of my friends in this session. So yeah, Danny referred to this paper in his talk yesterday. Some of this will be redundant, but so the puzzle that we're trying to address in this paper is the fact that for 18 countries in the economic transformation database, we document this negative correlation in African countries between growth from structural change and within sector productivity growth. So this is important because, you know, so the idea is that folks are moving out of agriculture into services and manufacturing, and that's raising productivity, economy-wide productivity. But the sectors folks are moving into are experiencing declining labor productivity. So, you know, if this continues, what we'll have is stagnation and sort of unless productivity growth can be driven by the agricultural sector. We find this in manufacturing, which is especially puzzling because we think of manufacturing as the canonical modern sector. So what we're going to do is use firm level data from the manufacturing sector from Ethiopia and Tanzania to try to better understand what's happening. And this is just the patterns I've just mentioned. Here you see for Africa, a downward sloping line would fit nicely through these points, whereas an upward sloping line would fit nicely through these Asian countries where structural change was accompanied by positive productivity growth. And this holds also for some newly industrializing Asian countries such as Bangladesh, Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar. So a potential explanation for these results is that we're seeing what we call demand-driven structural change in the African countries versus supply-driven structural change in the Asian countries. And what I mean by demand-driven structural change is, you know, folks' incomes in, say, rural areas or among the poor are rising, so either because of productivity improvements in agriculture or because of public transfers or public investment, or all of the above. And those rising incomes are increasing the demand for locally produced goods, but these are not these are not typically produced in the modern sector, they're produced in the informal sector. And here this graph is showing that manufacturing employment in Ethiopia has indeed risen, as Gaaitzen mentioned, and in a lot of other countries this has happened as well. But the dashed red line is the informal manufacturing employment, whereas formal sector manufacturing employment is relatively flat. It has increased, but not nearly enough to make a dent in the shares. The opposite holds here in the case of Vietnam. Let me just say, Gaaitzen brought this up, whether we find this for Ethiopia, Tanzania. In subsequent work, I've also found this pattern for Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. And to get more, for more countries to be included, we still need more data, more firm level data. So our empirical strategy for understanding why within sector productivity growth in the manufacturing sector is so low is to take the firm level data, and we have divided firms into 3 different categories: large and medium-sized firms, small-scale industry, and cottage industry. And cottage industry you can think of as household enterprises. And we focus on Ethiopia and Tanzania because they both had rapid labor productivity growth. They both have longitudinal data for the manufacturing sector, firm level data. And they've also sort of followed different industrialization strategies, whereas Ethiopia's strategy is focused on global value chains and exports to the West. Tanzania has strategy has focused much more on exporting to its neighbors, resource-intensive products. So what does the firm level data tell us about productive dualism in manufacturing? So this is, so for Tanzania, which is on the top, we only have the annual survey of industrial production for the formal sector firms. And here you can see value added per worker growth in small firms is pretty small, insignificantly different from 0, whereas productivity growth in the large firms is relatively rapid. By contrast, employment growth in the small firms is very rapid, whereas productivity growth in these large, sorry, oh, I mixed it around, sorry. So employment growth in the large firms is relatively low. So here you are already, you see productive dualism between small and large firms in the formal manufacturing sector in Tanzania. And in Ethiopia, we have even more disaggregated data, small scale industry survey plus the large and medium scale enterprise survey. And here you see value added per worker in the small and large formal firms is relatively, growth in value added per worker is relatively high, whereas in the small firms that don't use, that employ less than 10 workers, productivity growth is very low. And employment growth is in inverse proportion to productivity growth. So we see this productive dualism in the manufacturing sector, which is again surprising because we think of manufacturing as the canonical modern sector that drove poverty reduction in many countries. So why is there this productive dualism in manufacturing? There standard explanations are that small firms are subject to market failures that prevent their expansion, but as we have shown, the small firms are not more productive than the large firms, and we look at the firm size distribution, we see no evidence of a missing middle or bimodal distribution of firms. High labor costs is often offered as an explanation for limited employment growth in the formal sector, but our data show that the payroll shares in Ethiopia and Tanzania are very low. Poor business dynamism or the high entry costs, we also show that there's a lot of turnover in the manufacturing sector. Entry and exit rates are high and comparable to what we see in Vietnam. And high corruption or a poor business environment, if that were the case, why do we see relatively high productivity growth among the large firms? So our preferred explanation for why there is limited employment growth has to do with the capital intensity of the manufacturing sector in Ethiopia and Tanzania. And here we're comparing capital. So here we're comparing the capital intensity of manufacturing in Tanzania and Ethiopia to that in Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia is 100, and you can see for Tanzania, for the top 10% of large firms in Tanzania, they're even more capital intensive than the firms than the manufacturing firms in Czechoslovakia. And for Ethiopia, they're not quite as capital intensive as Czechoslovakia, but compared to their economy-wide capital labor ratios, they're much higher than what we would expect. So why do we think this is happening? Because we think this is because the firms in export sector have to adopt technologies, that are developed not in their own countries, but mostly in the West, or also now in China, for example. And the other point I should make is that, we compare also Tanzania and Ethiopia to firm level data from Vietnam. And one thing we noticed there is that the garment sector seems to be the last holdout for low capital intensity. And the garment sector in Ethiopia is almost non-existent in Tanzania. I mean, it exists, but it's really small. And in Ethiopia, it's still very small. So overall, you don't get the benefit of that sector.
Maggie, 1 minute, that's okay.
Okay, so yeah, so this is my last slide. So key points about excessive capital intensity, that, as I mentioned, they're much higher than what we would expect based on their relative labor abundance. And this is why I asked David Otter the question about if a country is abundant in low-skilled labor, how can we expect them to, make use of these very modern technologies that require highly educated workers? These capital labor ratios have increased much more rapidly in Tanzania and Ethiopia than in the economy as a whole. And this capital intensity leads to employment losses along 3 dimensions. So all countries have to shift their techniques. This is happening not just in Africa, but in other countries. African countries that are still very low skill labor abundant lose out on employment due to loss in comparative advantage. And African countries' steeper cost curve reduces their output elasticity of employment to positive demand shocks, for example. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks,
Maggie. Actually, Maggie, you had a question for Dino, so why don't you go ahead and ask that question?
Yeah. So David Otter alluded to a paper by Gordon Hanson, which has no facts to back it up. It's a thought piece, and he's saying that there's all these manufacturing jobs still in China, and that who knows where they'll land, and that for all we know, they could end up in rural areas in China.
Mel, I think Maggie might have muted herself accidentally.
Oh, no, I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear Maggie, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, Maggie, go ahead. I think I can hear you for sure.
Okay, so the question is, does Dino think that manufacturing jobs will move to rural areas of China where labor costs are lower? I know we're terrible at predicting the future, but I thought it was kind of an odd.
It's a good question, and as I say, I'm not really a China expert, but I think it's also shaped by not only what's happening within China's economy, but China's position and how China positions itself vis-a-vis the rest of the world, because a lot of the manufacturing moved to the coast when the emphasis was manufacturing for the world economy. And similarly, China's been very reluctant to allow too many people to move to these cities on the coast. So whatever happens with the global balancing between China and the rest of the world, and this becomes enormously political as well as economic, I think the Chinese are already thinking about this. They're already thinking about positioning closer to rural areas and developing some of these cities elsewhere. But the second challenge is this one of education, that the average number of people in 2013, when our data stopped, that had secondary education and above in China is 35%. the countries that have successfully moved from upper middle income status to high income status have tended to have ratios closer to 70%. And so one of the challenges I think faced by China is how do you get these rural workers through secondary education? The cost of doing that, given the economies of scale of having schools in urban areas, and in fact in China, the urban schools are much better than the rural schools, you've got to move people to the cities. You've got to allow them to get access to education in the cities. And the hukou system has been designed in such a way that children of rural hukou workers cannot go to schools in urban areas. And so part of the challenge has got to be, well, you've got this infrastructure in these cities that's very good at training and teaching. You've got to increase human capital. So you've probably got to allow people to put their children into schools in these big cities. So this is, it's a very kind of global picture answer, but I think it's not just about economics. I think there's the need to develop human capital in order that China doesn't find itself in a situation where technology leaves its workers behind. And then there's also this question of China having to position itself differently vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And this is being driven both by its own success and by global politics. So it's a very interesting and challenging time. But I suspect that people will move more dramatically to these cities than they have been allowed to previously as part of this aim to improve human capital. I hope that rounded up.
Okay. All right. There's a question for Maggie from Gary Fields. Maggie, do you want to just, Gary, do you want to actually ask the question live? I think you are allowed, you can unmute yourself, and if you want to do that quickly.
I saw the question. I can answer.
Sure.
Unless, Gary, did you want to say something? We are talking about labor productivity, not total factor productivity. So output per worker. And so was Danny.
Yeah, that's a very straightforward answer, actually.
Yeah.
There's a question for you, Maggie, again from Andreas Eberhard. How do we square high and rising capital labor intensity in firms in Sub-Saharan Africa with stagnant or even negative within sector manufacturing labor productivity gains? Is a higher capital labor intensity confirmed for smaller manufacturing firms? In your figure, you only showed KOL for large firms, I think.
Oh, right. So that's I think the answer there is easy. It's just that the share of labor-intensive tiny firms, which are not very productive, where productivity growth is even sometimes negative, the share of those firms is rising rapidly, much more rapidly than the number of capital-intensive firms. So on average, labor productivity is falling. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. Yep. Thank you, Maggie. We should move on to the next set of presentation, next two papers. So we have the next paper is by Nidhiya Menon from Brandeis University, Mining and Women's Agency, Evidence on Acceptance of Domestic Violence and Shared Decision-Making in India. Nidhiya?
Yeah, thanks, Kunal. So okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, you can see this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right, so thank you for this opportunity, and thank you all for being here. So this is joint work with my co-authors, Amanda Gambo, James G, and Yana Rogers. So in contrast to the papers that went before, we're going to do a very micro deep dive of what structural development brings to developing countries. And in this case, we're looking particularly in the Indian context, okay? Before I get into the nitty-gritty details of the paper, let me just give you a broad overview of what the intuition here is. So going back to Esther Bozerup's work from the early 1970s, which was sort of tested in very good fashion by Alessina, Nathan Nunn, and Paula Giuliano. The hypothesis there is that when women's labor is valued, their status is better. What the innovation of this paper is that we're going to take that intuition and apply it to the mining sector, okay? And as I said before, we're going to look at India. Okay, so our approach is essentially to estimate the impact of being proximate to mines, and that means within a 5-kilometer radius, to mines and to mineral deposits on different measures of women's agency. So the paper will go through in detail in terms of domestic violence, access to healthcare. We're going to sort of look at it more closely by focusing on mines that employ relatively high shares of female labor. We are going to look on the mirror side of this and sort of check that the results that we find for the women sample is being resonated among the male respondents as well. And then we're going to break down all of this by age groups to see whether there's heterogeneity along those lines. The mechanisms that we're going to examine, or the paper examines in detail, I'm not going to have time to show you everything, is in terms of human capital, employment gains, knowledge of and access to financial resources. And what I will show you here is this new thing that India brought into effect about 5 years ago, where mining royalties have to be shared with vulnerable populations, okay, that are resident in that area. The data is very simply the NFHS 4 from so these are the DHS surveys for India. We use the last round because these have the GIS coordinates that we need to match women in these clusters. So you want to think about clusters as villages to the closest mining deposit. And the methodology is a spatial diff in diff. We introduce some temporal aspects as we go along, but again, I'm going to leave you to read the paper for that. Let me just talk you through the list of results that we have, and I'll only be able to show you one or two. So women's outcomes, there's no question, improve in the close proximity of mines. Okay, so there's reduced acceptance of domestic violence. They report fewer barriers to accessing healthcare. These impacts are especially felt among the older women. And when we say older, this is above 25 years of age. We look at different age benchmarks, and this is where the effects are most pronounced. There are mirror results among men, so they are less likely to justify domestic violence. And mechanisms, I've already mentioned some. I'm going to show you some of the royalty results as we go along. Okay. So for those who might not know, mining in India, the country is very rich. So the focus usually when we talk about mining has been Africa for very good reasons, but India is very rich in mineral and metal deposits, over 1 billion tons annually that's produced. Most of this is differentiated among organized and unorganized lines. Our data is primarily from the organized sector, okay? But we acknowledge that there is an artisanal and a small scale unorganized sector that is very much present. Female employment in mining on average is low, but interestingly, it depends on the kind of mineral that's being mined, okay? So for example, things like quartz mining employ relatively high shares of female labor, so approximately about a fifth. But in contrast, if you look at things like coal and iron, it's less than 5%, right, as expected. So when we look at measures of domestic violence that are in the NFHS, so this is the woman reporting that physical violence is justified for, I'm going to list 5 reasons here, and then in column 6, we have this index measure, right, because we have to be careful about multiple hypothesis testing. So the first thing you want to notice is that the coefficients are uniformly negative. Let me just focus on the index measure. So what that 0.199 is saying, this one, 0.199 is saying, is that in the presence of deposits and in the presence of HFLS, active mines, and these are mines that employ relatively high shares of female labor, women are less likely to report, or 19.9 percentage points less likely to report that violence is justified, okay? The net effects on the young women are different. So younger women, who are less than 25 years of age, are actually more accepting of violence. And if you know the cultural and the social context in the Indian arena, this sort of makes sense because these are mostly families in which younger women are co-resident with older women, and there are other dynamics that have been examined by Diane Coffey and Dean Spear, sort of understanding what the empowerment aspects of this kind of co-residence means, and this is consistent with that. Let me just mention the royalties thing. So this was something that was put in place in 2013, where the law essentially says that a certain proportion of the mining royalties have to be invested in the welfare of women and children in that area. So I'm quoting directly here from the District Mineral Foundation Status Report, where, for example, in Chhattisgarh, which is a very rich mineral state in the middle of India, funds are being used for the creation of women empowerment centers to promote training, production, and market linkages. In Korba, which is also in Chhattisgarh, there's an alternate program that is providing, for example, better nutrition, access to food for pregnant women, distribution of medicine, etc. Okay. We conditioned on this with a bunch of things that we need to, using data from the census as well. And if you look at this third and fourth coefficients, what we see is the presence of these mining royalties will increase the proportion that the woman is in the workforce, that she's less likely to be in agriculture, more likely to be in manufacturing. Let me move along a little bit more. She's more aware of credit programs in her area, and has significantly more likely to have taken loans for starting entrepreneurial activities, okay, within her village. Okay, in most papers like this, we have to do, and we do a bunch of robustness and falsification, etc. tests. So the main test that we have to be careful about is sorting into these areas. Given that this is a different diff, there are checks for pre-trends. We do various falsification tests depending on the age of the mine. We determine whether the distances should be 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 15, etc., non-parametrically using spatial lag models. Let me talk a little detail about what our randomized placebo test here is. So if our model is wrong, you apply it to any constructed simulated data, it's going to reveal significant results. So to test that that is not the case in our example, what we do is we randomly displace the location of mines by 50 kilometers for 1,000 replications. And then we test whether our results are significant. And in the paper, you can see that the placebo coefficients are consistently at 0, which is what they should be, because this is just generated data, right? Simulated data, not true data. A bunch of other things that we are careful about is the level of political spending in the district. In response to the COVID pandemic, we've gone out and done some additional stuff in relation to measures relating to SES, demography, hygiene, epidemiology, etc. Some of this we have to be careful in terms of conflict. So we have 2 measures. So lootability, distance to the nearest gold diamond deposit within the country, Maoist conflict. We have to be, so this is India, we have to be careful about corruption. So we control for that using the number of village panchayats within, for every 1,000 inhabitants, which is a measure for accountability at that level. Role of public-private in terms of leased area that's held by the government, and also accountability being exerted by the local population by looking at an index measure for how engaged they are, okay, in terms of listening to the radio, watching TV, reading newspapers, etc. Okay.
Yeah, we got a last slide up.
I'm on my last slide. Yeah, so I timed it. So the conclusion, very broadly, is results have implications. So the mining has often had a bad rap for very good reasons. I think what we are trying to say here is, if you look at industries that value women's labor, the outcomes need not necessarily be bad. And what we would push for in terms of the policy of this paper would be, an emphasis on community dialogues and planning for which sort of brings in more of the local population, instead of this just being a top-down, top-down kind of process where mining comes in and there are these enclaves that build up, often not with, desirable consequences. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Nidhiya. We'll actually wait for Q&A for your paper till we get to the last paper by Taryn Dinkelman.
Okay.
Taryn, the last paper of this conference, actually. So go ahead. Thanks.
All right, let me get my slides up here and say, hopefully you can see all of that. All right, I can't see myself. I can't see you. Hopefully you guys
we can see you and we can see the slide. Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you. Thanks so much for the organizers, and thanks to Kanal for putting together this session. I'm excited to be the last presentation standing between you and your weekend after a 3-day conference. So hopefully I'm going to be able to use my short time to give you a little bit of interesting facts to think about in your weekends. This paper is new work joint with Rachel Nagai at LAC. And it's really trying to think a little bit more about time use and gender in Africa during times of structural transformation. Here you go. So the starting point, or the jumping off point for our paper, which is part descriptive evidence and part review of recent papers and development. The starting point is that time reallocation is really central to the process of economic development. As economies develop and go through the structural transformation, we know that workers shift their time across sectors, and they shift their time from home towards market. We know a lot about how this process of time reallocation works, and within rich countries in particular. We know a lot about historically rich countries, how the patterns of women's time use have changed, shifting from home to market and shifting from agriculture largely to service work. So what we're going to focus on in this paper is trying to provide some new evidence on how women in Africa are spending their time. And the first graph that I have up here is basically demonstrating that there is some structural transformation in the sector of work among women using the Africa sector database from the Groningen Growth and Development Center. So you can see as countries are getting richer, these are 11 African countries, as they get richer, the share of women's employment in agriculture is falling on the left-hand side, women's employment in agriculture, and the share of women working in services is rising. That's the graph on the right-hand side. The middle one is manufacturing, and it's pretty low throughout. So, as I said, what we're interested in this paper is to think a little bit more about using time use data to describe how African women are currently spending their time, and to present some new facts that help us think about what some of the main frictions might be that women might face as economies go through the structural transformation, and the frictions that they might face, which could slow down this shift and reallocation of time from home to market, and potentially across market sectors as well. The second part of the paper, which I'm actually not going to talk a lot about today at all, is we review some recent evidence on specific policies that might address the friction, some of the frictions that we're going to highlight, in order to improve the allocation of labor, and particularly female labor, across sectors. So just to start out with, I'm going to show you a couple graphs and one set of results. What these two graphs are basically focusing on is both the extensive and the intensive margin of work for African women. And so we want to move away a little bit from talking about this this pattern of the U shape of female employment across the development spectrum, focusing just on the variation in income across countries within Africa. We can see on the left-hand side that female labor force participation is basically declining. As countries are getting richer within Africa, employment of women is declining, and there's a huge amount of heterogeneity across the continent. So we have some countries that have some of the highest female labor force participation rates in the world, as well as some countries that have some of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world on the same continent. So this heterogeneity is going to be something important for thinking about frictions to work in the market. And then on the right-hand side, what you see here is we've plotted the average number of hours that women are working in the market, which is the green triangles below, and the average number of weekly hours that women are working at home in home production in the red dots. And so this is just a smaller set of African countries for which we have time use data. And what you see here is that there's a large gap between the average amount of time for the same country spent in home production versus market production. And all of these countries for which we have time use data are basically saying that women are spending at least the amount of time that would be required for a full or a part-time job just on home production, and many fewer hours in market work. And so what you have is that a lot of countries where we can actually look at participation and market hours, we see high market participation, but also a small number of market hours. Women are often combining low market hours with very high home production hours. And so we're going to use this to think about frictions as well, this gap. So on the extensive margin of work, one of the things we highlight in the paper is the role of cultural norms that vary across parts of Africa that are likely going to be very important for as a constraint on moving time from home into the market. And so what I've shown you here is for sub-Saharan Africa on the left and North African countries on the right, the distribution of women across different labor market states. And I have to apologize, I missed the session earlier in the conference on looking at measuring the ILO session on measuring employment. These are, I believe these are data from the ILO. And so the pattern that I want you to take away from these graphs is that there are very large differences in the participation rate across North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So female labor force participation rate is just much, much lower in North African countries. The second thing I want you to take away from these graphs is that over a 30-year period, the distribution of employment across these different sectors is basically stagnant for women's employment. So there isn't a whole lot of change over time in the type of work women are doing. And then thirdly, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of women's work is either own account work or as a contributing family worker. So a lot of these jobs are on farms. And the key thing about family farms is that it allows the combination of home and market production to happen in the same place at the same time. And so one of the things that we talk about in the paper is how this particular pattern of a high participation of women's work in the market combined with home production on family farms is something that has been documented for the US historically and is very similar to the pattern that we see in Sub-Saharan Africa today. So switching to thinking about the intensive margin of work, that earlier graph I showed you that many women are working many more hours in home production than they are in the market. What we do is we combine time use survey from the set of countries that we have the micro data for with time use survey data from the US historically. And we try and compare the number of hours spent in home production across these different countries and time periods, and also look at the composition of time spent in home production. And so there are a couple of interesting facts that we document. One is obviously that in the US from the 1920s to 2010, there's been a big decline in total weekly hours in home production. And there's a lot of that decline is accounted for by a reduction in time spent in cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry. In contrast, the African countries for which we have data and that are at different levels of income still spend, housewives in these countries spend upwards of 40 hours a week in home production. And the lion's share of time that they are spending in that home production is still in cooking, cleaning, and laundry. And so we have a discussion in the paper about some of the key issues that might prevent movement of time from home into market work in these African settings that where households may not have the access to the same kind of infrastructure that households in richer countries have had, as early as the 1960s. So, kind of summing up, what we take away from our description of differences in the extensive margin of work and patterns in the intensive margin of work using the time use survey data is that there are two broad constraints that may slow down the structural transformation of women's work as African economies grow and as they change. On the one hand, there seem to be important social norms and cultural barriers that prevent or restrict women's market work, but that these seem to have a very regional dimension to them. At the same time, there are also large technological barriers to marketizing home production. So, for example, a lack of infrastructure for doing basic cooking and cleaning, a lack of childcare or elder care facilities are things that are potentially in the way of shifting that balance of time between home and market hours. We talk about, in the second part of the paper, we review a number of empirical studies from the development literature that try to target one or the other type of barrier in a sort of policy framework, and we sort of draw out what we might learn from those policies, whether they might work at a broader scale to reduce the frictions to moving women's time from home to market. But I think the bottom line of our paper is that we know historically that barriers to women's work in rich countries led to a significant misallocation of labor and reduced economic growth. And so thinking about what barriers might be in place in low and middle income countries today may actually reduce the chances of that misallocation continuing. So I will stop there. I'm not sure what my time is like, but I'm sure everyone is ready to be done.
Okay, Taryn, thanks so much. It was a very nice presentation. There are a couple of questions. We already actually are over time. So the first question, let me just ask these questions to you, and you can maybe think of whether you want to respond or take them forward later on. First question is that about the question, productivity in market work. How does it compare productivity in home production? Because productivity in market work would be mostly informal services. Do you have a sense of that?
So there's a paper by Richard Rogerson and Berthold Herrendorf and I think his name is Georg Bridgman, where they actually try and use the time use diary stuff to estimate productivity in the market in the home. And their finding is actually that home productivity is significantly lower than market productivity. Yeah.
That's interesting, yeah. And there was a question from Gaaitzen Kulwal. Maybe you can read the question yourself on the chat. It's asking about the graph in slide 4. How are individuals producing mainly for own consumption categorized, especially after the ICLS change?
So that's a really great question. I believe that in the data series we were using, they would be own account workers. But I should go back and check. And as I said, I apologize for missing the earlier session on measuring who's employed. I should go back and watch that too. But I believe we counted them in the series. They were defined as own account workers.
Right, absolutely. All right, I think Nidhiya, I had a question for you, but I'm going to ask it to you. I'll probably write to you separately because we're already out of time. That's okay. And let me conclude this session by thanking the 6 presenters. It's a really interesting session. I wish there was more time for discussion, but that's the way these things are. We have very little time for Q&A, but it's wonderful to listen to all the presentations. I'm going to hand over to Ian Walker, who's one of the 4 organizers of this conference who we haven't seen as yet, even though Ian has been so involved in the conference all the way through. So Ian, over to you. Your concluding remarks. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kunal. So we're over time. Let me be brief. I think it's been a great 3 days. We've had a packed and fascinating agenda, 2 really interesting keynotes, a policy panel, special session with the ILO on measuring women's work that was just mentioned. Now 8 ordinary sessions, over 50 or around 50 papers on critical issues related to jobs and development issues, plus a gamut of themes. So I think it's been a great conference, and it really just falls to me to thank everybody who's participated, our partners, UN Wider, ISA, and the Network on Jobs and Development, all of the backup staff who've done a fantastic job making this run like a ball-bearing mousetrap, everything really, really smooth and competent. Everybody who submitted papers, everybody who presented, and above all the audience. And I think that there are around 80 of us still left in at the death. We should get a special prize for stamina. And I just wanted to say that I really look forward to continuing to work together with all of you on this critical agenda over the next year. And as we move out, hopefully, of COVID into a post-COVID epoch. I do think that it's great that the theme of structural transformation has come so strongly through various keynotes and specials and sessions in this conference, because I do think if there's one big question that we all need to be asking and helping to answer, it's, well, where are the better jobs going to come from in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries? What can we do as either academics to understand that better, or as policymakers to help to make it happen? So what are the policies that can help to accelerate the growth of better jobs in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries as we move into the post-COVID period? Let's settle that question on our minds and think about how much rich information this conference has provided that help us to understand and answer that question better. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. Take care. Have a good weekend, all. Bye.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.